Just give it just a sec for it to load up. And we are live.
All right. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Councilor Mejia's first youth forum. We are so happy that you're here and you have joined us on this exciting time in terms of having a conversation with our young people. So today we are focusing on youth mental health, their social and emotional well-being. It's important to be aware of the stresses that a pandemic can have on young people. Their routines are disrupted. Some may get sick or know others who are sick. Many teens are feeling isolated and frustrated during the current pandemic. And shelter in place and ongoing distancing precautions needed for the foreseeable future have many of our young people having agonizing questions on everyone's mind. How long will this last? And I'm sure we are all kind of thinking that. I would imagine that it's not just our young people, but it's all of us thinking, how long will this last? With no clear answers at this time of a national pandemic, teens, I would imagine, frustrated, and their frustrations are on the rise. And our hope today is to just give young people a voice and an opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully we can give some and provide some really great answers, and maybe give you even information about different resources. We have a really great group of folks here that's going to get us started. And before we actually get going, we are going to have each one of the panelists introduce themselves. I'm co-hosting today with an amazing young person, and I'm going to have her tell you about herself, and then we'll have the rest of the panelists kind of give you a little bit of about who they are, the work that they have done with young people, and then we'll get started. It's over to you, Naesoj.
Thank you, Dr. Gayl. Hello, I'm Naesoj here co-hosting with Dr. Gayl. Happy to be here. I am 16 years old and a sophomore at O'Brien's. I've worked with numerous youth organizations such as Madison Park Development Corporation, Boston Community Action Team with Teen Empowerment, and I recently worked with I Have a Future on the Youth Justice Rally we had in late February.
Right, great, thank you. Naesoj. So I'm going to start with, it's interesting in terms of how the screen goes and who's on your screen and who's on your left. So I'm going to go with who's on my left. And I see on my left, I have Dr. Jim Recht. I'm going to have him introduce himself, tell you a little bit about himself and his work with young people, and then I'll get to the next person.
Sure. My name is Jim Recht. Thank you, Dr. Swaby. And I'm a psychiatrist. I work mostly in Cambridge and Somerville. I see a number of patients from Everett and some from Chelsea as well. But the clinic that I work in most of the time is the Central Street Clinic in Somerville. And the people that I work with come to see me, young adults, teenagers starting around age 16 and then going all the way up from there. Come to see me for problems including anxiety, depression, family and relationship issues, and mixed in there a lot of issues related to substance use, as we all know, very commonly in combination with anxiety and depression. So that's the kind of work that I do, and I'm looking forward to learning and helping as much as I can today. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. Recht. Dr. Jackman?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Charmain Jackman, and I am a licensed psychologist. I serve as the Dean of Health and Wellness at Boston Arts Academy, where I work with youth in grades 9 to 12. My role is combination of providing direct service in terms of therapy services, but also supporting our teachers around curriculum and integrated social emotional learning into our curriculum. I lead a team of other mental professionals, and it's just a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to other youth in Boston. We've done our best to support our students during this time, and just excited to hear about how we can continue to support you, given the extension of the school closures.
Great, thank you. Dawn Fuentes Holgate, you're up next.
Good evening. My name is Dawn Fuentes Holgate. I'm a mental health clinician with New Generations and Associates. I'm also a coach, a life coach. But my current association with youth is I'm teaching at BYS. So at the moment I'm working with them around depression, anxiety, and just getting back into the school system itself to be able to get college courses while they're at. And it's a pleasure being here tonight.
Great, thank you. Shara Bullock.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sharlene Bullock. I am a licensed mental health clinician, and currently I work working with adults primarily in substance abuse, so I provide trauma counseling to them. But when I first got started, probably 20-something years ago, I actually started working with at-risk youth. Having been one myself years ago, I knew that, the kind of support that they needed. So I started off in the field of working with adolescents with trauma issues, PTSD, anxiety, doing mentorship and counseling.
All right, great, thank you. So thank you all for being here, and we are going to get started. So one of the things I know they have been saying is that the greatest fear of a lot of young people, at least 2 out of 10, is, they're thinking in terms of the stressors that they're dealing with. They may have questions such as, am I safe? Are the people who are caring for me safe? And how will this situation affect their daily lives? I think often about this song. I'm a huge fan of Yolanda Adams. And she has this song that is called What About the Children? And as I was thinking about, because a few people kind of know that song. And as I was thinking about, sort of running this and being a part of this, that's the first song that came to my mind, was the song What About the Children? And it talks a lot about what about the children, ignoring them. We tend to sometimes ignore young people, not really letting them have a voice. And just a few verses that says, what about the children? To ignore is so easy. So many innocent children would choose the wrong way. So what about the children? Remember when you were children. So it's asking us as adults to remember when we were children. And if not for those who loved us and who cared for us to show us, where would we be today? So oftentimes I think about those people, those connections that I had as a young person that was helpful to help me get along the way. So I just want to put that in some context. So my first question that's going out to the panel is that the words of that song resonate with me so much, but based on your experience or your work with young people, and what are you hearing and what do you know about young people, is that what we all know about young people is that oftentimes they can hide their emotions much better than a whole lot of other people. So with the closings of school, or knowing that they don't have to go back to school for the rest of the school year, and there's not enough adults who would have the usual eye or for them to have the regular connections to young people, what are some challenges or risk factors we need to pay attention to as we think about our young people, especially in our Black and Brown communities? So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Jackman.
Sure, thank you. I think some of the things that I want to highlight is we know that students have different ways of coping and managing, but one of the highest risk is the social isolation, and for teens, social connection for many teens or most teens, social connection is their outlet. That's where they thrive. That's where they operate from, having that relationships and contact with their friends. And so having to be quarantined means that contact is taken away. And so it can lead to social isolation. I've heard students, spending most of their days in their rooms, just coming out for food, not having any exercise or outdoor activities at all. I've heard students really struggle to, kind of balance getting on a schedule or staying on a schedule that prioritizes sleep. I've seen and heard students who have gone outside and connected with friends despite the quarantine orders. So, risk-taking can be also part of adolescent journey. And so I think some of the things I worry about is either for students who already have a predisposition to anxiety and depression, that their symptoms can worsen. And if they're in a place where they don't feel like they can talk to their family members about what they're experiencing, they could be suffering in silence. So those are some things that I will start off, and I'd love to hear what other people have to say. We can continue that conversation.
Okay, great, thank you. You're on mute if you were trying to speak, Charlene.
Yeah,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to comment on that also. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about, and I had some conversations with a couple of my family members, you do have youth who are in a single parent home. And so with that being said, you might have mom or dad out working, so they're home alone by themselves. And so for parents, trying to create a structure for them, but they also have to deal with the stress of being at work themselves and possibly being at risk of having COVID. In fact, that did happen to someone that I'm aware of, where the parents actually got COVID and brought it home, and the child now has COVID. So there's that anxiety of, okay, what's going to happen to me? Also, you have some parents who are working overnight shifts. So you have kids who are actually struggling with night tremors and breaks in their sleeping patterns. So, I mean, I think those are a lot of things to be concerned about as well, especially when it comes to single parented homes.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was also going to say that I don't necessarily work with children on, one-on-one, but I do with the family. And some of the students that I have, they're also parents, right? So sometimes they're concerned with the fact that their children do not have enough social support, and that is one of the main, and getting enough rest, that their entire system clock is off. So it's just how to get them back on some sort of schedule.
Yeah. One of the not sure what that noise is, but one of the comments that I'm hearing is that that's coming from our Facebook live feed, is that there are many kids who are not able to identify and even name those feelings because it's their first time even feeling anything, right? And because they don't have the words to articulate that, then that experience is even more compounded in a very different way for those young people. And so with that being said, what can we do? What tips can you offer even parents or even young people in terms of how to go about identifying and even naming some of those feelings? What are some ways in which they can go about doing that?
I'm going to say spending time with your children, making time. I think having a special designated time of the day that you're sitting, you're talking, you're encouraging your kids to kind of talk about how they feel and normalize that. I do think it is going to be important to provide the kids with some sort of education as to what's going on in their community, so that they're aware, not to scare them, so that they're aware, but really it does start with sitting down, having a conversation with your children, supporting how they feel, even sharing your feelings as an adult. I think that that does make it even more comforting and nurturing for children to see that their parents are actually experiencing the same anxiety, the same fear of not, of not knowing what's going to happen.
I think
Yeah,
that's
and
so important. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Jackman.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I would even go a step before that, just in terms of naming what those symptoms look like for people. So for parents or caregivers and for the youth. So some of the signs that we see with anxiety and depression, I think the hard thing with being in a very different routine, it can be really difficult to hide or to see. So seeing changes in mood behavior, so maybe more irritability, noticing just, again, spending all day in the room, even though that's sometimes teens tend to do. I think it's at this time, I would really try to discourage that. So I think that could be a warning sign. Again, so the irritability, change in mood, either having no feelings, very kind of flat, not feeling like there are no emotions or feeling numb. Those are some of the big things I would say. Also, having trouble just, again, talking about what's happened for them. Maybe not connecting with friends. So, not wanting to engage in Facebook or FaceTime or things that they usually used to do. Seeing changes in those things. Those are some of the things that I would definitely pay attention to.
Okay. Dr. Recht, I saw that you were going to make a comment earlier.
Sure. I really just want to reinforce what you guys are pointing to. A couple of thoughts. First, I think it's natural for us as parents to worry that we can somehow, by saying the wrong thing or showing the wrong kind of emotion, that somehow that can somehow make things worse. I think it's natural for parents to worry that if they bring up depression, anxiety, or substance use problems, that somehow that could lead to a problem that didn't exist. And a lot of my work is reassuring young adults and parents that it's safe to talk about these things. And in fact, it's powerful and healthy to talk about these things. So reinforcing what Dr. Jackman and is it Sharlene were saying about taking the time to try to voice those feelings, partly because it helps kids to see that their parents are human too and are struggling and overcoming these difficult problems. And also because, as you were saying, it's pretty natural for young adults to struggle to put words on these strange feelings that they're having. Every young adult, every teenager is different, but in general, it's a time when these emotions are becoming more colorful than usual, more varied. It's very difficult to put words on. So being able to use parents as examples can be very powerful too.
Dr. Gayl, we have a question from Darius.
Okay, go right ahead. Tell us.
How does this affect our youth who are comfortable with being in a depressed state or who in fact like being disconnected?
So I'll start with the second part of the question, who like being disconnected. And there are definitely people who, whether it's feeling more introverted or just don't mind operating in isolation or just in their own space. I think that's fine. And if that's part of who they have been prior to COVID, then that's absolutely fine. If it's a significant change from how they behaved or interacted before, then that would be a warning sign. In terms of comfortable being in a depressed state, I would challenge that. I've worked for many years and I don't know anyone who's comfortable being in a depressed state. I've seen people who are not aware they're in a depressed state because it's their quote unquote normal, but I've never seen people who've been comfortable that way. I think, again, sometimes we don't know how to name the things we're experiencing, or we have people just struggle with asking for help. Like, how do I ask for help? How do I explain to somebody what I'm feeling when I don't even know how to explain it for myself? So sometimes those are the things that I would kind of question and challenge with that statement.
Absolutely. And I just want to interject here and welcome Councilor Mejia, who is on the line, has joined us. We are so happy that you're here. You can say a few words before we move on, but go right ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to be disruptive. I was at another public hearing. I feel this whole idea of being stuck in traffic and being late to a meeting, now it's Zoom, that you're like, these meetings run a little bit later and hearings go a little bit longer. So my apologies for just joining you, but I am really grateful to each and every one of you for utilizing this space to create space for our young people who are carrying a lot right now and feeling really isolated, and to have people of color who recognize the trauma that our kids are carrying and are able to help our kids through this means the world to our office, and super grateful to be in partnership with each of you, and Naesoj, who's our youth liaison, who actually was the one who really inspired this conversation. We had a community conversation a few weeks ago around the state of the health for Black and Brown families in the time of COVID-19. And during that conversation, she raised up the issues that a lot of young people were feeling isolated and feeling disconnected. And Dr. Gayl Crump-Swaby reached out and said, well, why don't we do something about it? And I was like, you know me, I'm like, yes, let's do it. And so within weeks, here we are having this conversation, creating the space for young people, and looking forward to continuing this. I do have some ideas of what it can look like moving forward. My thinking is, as we begin to bring in more young people into the conversation, is that we would most likely probably do breakout rooms with small cohorts of folks as a way for young people to be able to connect. So that's just further along the lines of thinking, but really looking forward to expanding this. I really do think now that school is not opening up again until September, there's a lot of programming that I'm thinking about for the summer months, especially as we start seeing violence uptick. I really do believe we have an opportunity to utilize the space in real meaningful ways, and look forward to your partnership and figuring out how we can bring some resources so that you all can do this work in ways that don't continue to put you all in financial hardships either. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Gayl.
All right, thank you, thank you. So just to kind of continue on one of the things that I think we have noticed is that there are several different types of children, but I'm thinking in two groups here, right? So someone sort of talked a little bit about it, and I think Dr. Jackman sort of mentioned it. You have a group of young people who love to be connected, like to be physically connected to others. And then you have, so when they were at school, that provide a sense of safety net for them. It provide an opportunity to see their friends, to connect with their peers on a daily basis. Then you have another group of students where being in that kind of environment was difficult for them. So because the anxieties that it raised for them, if they have social anxiety or if they're more introverted and those kinds of things. So what do we say about those? What can we say about those two groups of young people, and how do we make sure that we are meeting the needs of those two kinds of groups of young people that we've seen? I'm sure there are more others, but I think those are the two sets. The group that really needs to have and see their friends on a regular daily basis, and then the other group of young people who being in school was a challenge, not because of the academic piece of it, but because of being in physical distance and social distance with others. So I'm just going to leave that kind of open there and see where people go with that.
Hi, Gayl. I think it goes back to, like I said, it's having conversations, keeping the lines of communication open to kind of get them in, a little bit more invested in what's going to change with them. What is it that they want? What do they need? What do they like? Again, it is about conversation, but I wanted to backpedal a little bit. We're talking about parents and caregivers and like what they can do to help their children, kind of deal with this change. But also I was thinking about, what resources do parents or caregivers need? We also have to take into accountability their vulnerabilities as well. So I think that it's important that a family create some sort of a safety plan. Who are we going to call? What resources are we going to utilize? We don't want to forget about the needs that parents have as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think to your question, Gayl, around how do you kind of manage these two different sets of students? I think kind of knowing whether it's from the school perspective, I think finding ways to help help students connect, whether it's through the Google Classroom, but how are you making sure when the students come into your classroom online, how are you creating a space for them to engage with each other, whether it's using breakout rooms or smaller spaces for them to connect, because they do have many of them have a natural tendency to want to just talk and chat. I think those students really miss this outlet. And maybe some of those might be the ones who then take more risk in terms of, I'm just going to go find a time to go see my friends because that's what I need. I'm driven by this need, and may not have a sense of the danger or the risk that they're exposing themselves and their families to. So I think from a parent perspective or a caring adult perspective, it's really kind of like Sharlene was saying, sitting down and having a conversation here, giving them an opportunity to express what they're feeling, and trying to problem solve, with them. So I think knowing that they naturally have a need to want to connect, not pretending that that's going to go away because we're in quarantine orders, but engaging them around that.
Right.
I would just to build on that. One thought I had is, and I think all of us have had this experience working with young adults and their families, it takes time as well. And that's a very difficult challenge right now, where each day kind of blends into the next and it can feel like forever. But I would want to reassure a lot of the young adults I work with, I do try to reassure people that it's worth stretching oneself to try to be patient. You begin to try to talk about things in a way that you haven't before, and that's not easy. It's like learning any new thing. Same for parents. If you try to start a conversation and things maybe backfire, somebody's a little cranky that evening, it's not the right day, don't let that get you down. Know that what you are doing is still powerful. I was just going to say on slightly different subject, going back to, how, young people are different, at least two groups. I think that's true, Dr. Swaby, kind of the more socially comfortable ones or outgoing ones versus the ones that are more comfortable kind of being self-contained. For me, another basic question is, what's all right? What is okay, especially under abnormal circumstances like this? And I always want to, I try to bring myself back as a clinician and also help families and young adults come back to think about what is, if I'm, if I'm 17 and I'm usually a little on the low key side, and things don't get me all that excited and I kind of take things passively, okay, and that's the way I'm continuing, then that's really okay. So I really do want to emphasize that. What I think we're looking for, sort of risk signs or red flags are changes. And what I wanted to add to that is not just emotional changes or changes that we all think of as emotional, a little sadder, crying more often, more sullen, but also physical changes, headaches, stomach aches, not being hungry all of a sudden, not enjoying food that I used to really get excited about. Physical changes can also be signs that something is not quite right. And I think it's helpful to know that we can ask then about that. If young person we see is really, wow, just, has really slowed down or maybe lost a couple of pounds or gained a couple of pounds, might be eating more than usual because of out of anxiety. Those are also signs that we can ask about and signal that it's okay to talk about.
And so while we're on the subject of groups of students and teenagers and children, we have a question from Charmain, and they said, how does this impact youth who have IDD issues with cognitive delays and unable to verbalize what they're feeling or deny feelings?
Yeah, so we're talking about those young people who have additional sort of, you know, delays, not just the young people who are able to, that they know exactly what they're feeling and even having difficulties articulating it, or these feelings are new for them. But what about those young people who may have some additional issues, and how do we help them, you know, sort of verbalize or articulate those feelings? And, you know, what are some things we can look for? What are some tips we can give them in being able to help them find ways of expressing those feelings rather than holding them in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, you know, whatever process that you would use to talk to those students about other feelings that they have. So if their IDD means intellectual developmental delays. So maybe if it's using stories or using more pictures. So I have kids who are younger, so you know, I ask about feelings. A lot of it is like goes over their head, but I know routine is what they're used to, and disruption in routine is what they react to. So finding ways to spell that out or lay that out for your children. So again, whether it's drawing pictures or trying to maintain some semblance of a routine in your home to help those children navigate this uncertainty that's happening for us and for them.
I have one question that sort of shifts a little bit. So one of the things we've heard quite a lot is about young people having too much screen time, right? So we talked about that. Now the screen time is even, you know, has expanded or compounded even more. So what are your thoughts about that, and how can we help, you know, them sort of begin to, you know, navigate the ability to, yes, still stay socially connected, because we're telling them to physical distance, right? And physical distance mean not being in the space with your friends, and we're saying, but maintain your social connections, right? And how do they do that? Their cell phones. Now we have FaceTime. Now we have Zoom. Now they can, you know, they were probably already doing it. Those who have PlayStation, they can talk to each other. So what do we say to these young people in terms of the screen time and managing that? And yeah, I'm going to leave that there. Yeah,
we need to bring back rotary phones. That's what we need to do.
I don't think those young people are going to be happy to hear that. But anyway, go ahead.
That is such a loaded topic, Gayl. It's one that I struggle with, and you know, having to navigate my own children's school and their schools feeling obligations to give my kids a whole lot of work and keep them engaged, right? It's about keeping them engaged, but it is a loaded issue. And I really maintain that we should not be exposed, you know, given too much screen time. So I still feel like we should not throw out science because we're in a quarantine. So, but it is hard to navigate. So yeah. I'm curious what other people are thinking or how they're navigating this.
There's something that I found that really worked lately with mine is that we're doing board games and we're engaging in other type of games, right? So
board games, yeah.
Games. Yeah. Awesome.
I think I was going to say, you know, it might be helpful to develop some type of schedule. So when the kids are getting up in the morning, what are you going to do between 9 and 11? Whether that's exercise, making sure that they're eating healthy, just creating that type of schedule, they can learn how to take care of themselves. and having that time block for, you know, using PlayStation or Facebook or whatever it is that they use these days, but having a schedule that's consistent, I think is really important.
I really agree about routine. We've touched on the importance of routine, schedule, predictability on a couple of different points, and I really think that's an important one. It's difficult, right? Because as young, I mean, I still remember this as a teenager. You can bristle against a parent or another adult kind of pushing you to stay on a schedule, but it's good medicine. It has a very few side effects as well. And it tends, getting back to the question about intellectual delays, I think as Dr. Jackman was saying, we want to emphasize the usual routines, maybe even more, where repetition, routine, predictability for kids with developmental delays, it becomes even more important now. But that same thing goes for, you know, all of us in various ways. So the idea of a daily schedule, even if it feels a little bit artificial, I think, wow, I really encourage people to go with that.
Yeah. I definitely agree with the routine, and that's something I definitely emphasize. And I've also heard parents struggle with being able to enforce that. One, if they have to go to work, then they can't enforce it, or they don't want to get in an argument. If the child, the youth stays up till 2 o'clock in the morning and then can't wake up at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I think it becomes a place for argument and conflict for families. And when you're in a confined space,
absolutely,
for many hours on end, it may just be easy to just say, you know what, do what you want. So
yes,
it's definitely a struggle.
Yeah, confined space and even closed spaces, and even spaces where it's smaller and there's a lot more people. And how do you manage that? It's really tough and difficult for these families. Julia, I saw you was.
Yes, because I came in late, I'm going to ask the question. I'm not going to make an assumption. I'm just wondering if you've gotten through some of the questions. There was a question here from Christian White in particular. It's regarding for young people who already feel marginalized prior to this pandemic. Yes. And did you guys address that question already?
I was headed there next, but that's great.
I'll read it.
Yes,
so this is from Christian Wright. He does a lot of work with young people. So his question is, for young people whom feel and have already felt marginalized prior to and up through this pandemic, whom habitually miss many days of school and were often together or often forgotten about the due of ineffective outreach methods, what would you suggest going forward to ensure that they're being reached and received needed services? So I'll add to that because for me, I think about a lot of young people who are chronically absent from school, who are already feeling disengaged and disconnected. And now with this situation, I'm sure they probably feel even more so isolated. And so could you give me some insight to that? And then he has another question. So I want to answer that question first for him.
Okay. I think that's an excellent point. And I think I can lift up the model that we've used at our school, and it's really having an adult responsible for a small group of students. So it's an advisory system. And we've really been diligent about making sure we reach each child and each parent just as a check-in. And I know there's some students who have retreated and not engaged, but we either try, if we can't get the student, we talk to the parents so that we are maintaining some contact with the family. But I think it is a time where we definitely want to make sure that we are connecting. And I think the best way to do that is to assign students to an adult. And that's their responsibility to check in with that student.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And then his second question is, many students will be socially promoted due to this pandemic being nobody's fault. Many of the same students, many on IEPs, will find themselves in educational situations they are simply not ready for. What will this do in the long run in the education and subsequent economy developments and gaps. I guess this is really about if kids are going to get socially promoted, just because it is what it is, how is that going to impact them in the long run? And what would you recommend? I'm adding more to his question because I'm intrigued by that too, but
Yeah.
I'm curious, what as professionals, what do you think about this notion of being socially promoted when you may not be prepared academically?
And one of the, and I'm just going to add a little bit more fuel to the fire in terms of the economics that goes along with it too, in terms of families who are already marginalized and may not even have the type of income or the resources to put into their family in order to help that uneven academic instability that we may see with young people. So what are people's thoughts about, how do we manage that, or what are some tips in terms of we can begin to think about in regards to that particular situation?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Christian, I think was the question.
Yeah.
I think schools in the district will have to be really intentional about how they transition students back to school, right? What will that back to school look like? Will it be a point of, will there be assessments to see where students are at and what they need? I think that I guess the circumstances is that everybody's in that situation. So everybody's going to need some kind of remediation or whatever that word is to help get people back on track. But I think that transition back to school is going to be very important in terms of not just for educationally, but I think from a mental health, behavioral health perspective. I think we're going to see a lot of students have a lot of reactions and emotions that they've probably kept tight for a long time, and that we're really going to need a lot of support when schools open back. So, yeah.
And thank you. And I do, Gayl.
Yes.
I'm not going to step into the moderator role here and just start asking you a whole bunch of questions that I'm getting from online.
But I can't see the online questions. So
do you mind if I help out with that a little bit?
Yes, because I can't see the questions. So go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Naesoj.
Oh, I just want to ask a question. Dr. Jackman said something about assigning teenagers to their adults that they have to check in with. Often I find that a lot of adults are asking teenagers to come to them, but how are we going to make sure that the world is going to teenagers and to their preferred platforms and bringing stuff and putting it in front of their face for them to want to care and engage?
This is a great point, that we talk about responsibility. The adults with the authority and the means, they have responsibility here. And I think what Dr. Jackman first mentioned about this, the potential power of small assignments of relatively small groups of young people to adults who then need to be held responsible for reaching out in a positive direction, in a way that's lifting and not demanding. So I think you're right on there. There needs to be a broader acceptance, though, in the system, including in the public school system, of that sort of direction of responsibility. The other point I just wanted to kind of emphasize is when we talk about a young person's readiness for promotion, if I'm a 9th grader or 10th grader and am being, for what it's worth, socially promoted in an atmosphere in a school that is not adequately resourced, where the teachers are not generating positivity, of course I'm not going to do well in a rigid and negative atmosphere like that. If I find myself promoted socially into a flexible atmosphere where people are trained and expert at recognizing my strengths, recognizing my own personal creativity, recognizing my vulnerabilities, then I'm going to do more than fine. So when we talk about the kid, I'd rather encourage people in the system to think about where are the resources that's going to determine, and the expertise that's going to determine whether a socially promoted young adult does well. It's not the kid's strengths or weaknesses. It's the system's ability to welcome and nurture them.
Great point.
Naesoj, this is a youth panel discussion. I need to slow my roll and step to the side and
Yes.
see if you had any other questions or things you want to bring up to this conversation.
Yeah, I was gonna ask Naesoj in terms of, well, what are you hearing from your peers in terms of what they're dealing with?
I think the most problematic thing right now is the fact that like even Mr. Jim just brought up adults needing to be like experts in working with children and working with their special needs. But I think the biggest thing is we're not relatable to the adults, and the adults aren't relatable to us. And I think that's mainly just because we're from two different generations, and they're like, adults haven't tried to kind of like understand teenagers and children's and young adults. But I think the same for children, teenagers, young adults. We haven't tried to understand where the adults are coming from. And I think when there's more of a coming together or a community, that's when like teenagers are going to be like, that's when it's going to be most effective, the relationships between adults and teenagers. And I think another thing is the fact that there aren't enough programs that accept teenagers for them. There are a lot of programs that are trying to change teenagers into what they think that they should be, but there's not enough saying, okay, this is how you want to be. Let me help you be this way and still be productive in society.
Yes.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about those young people who were also responsible for helping out with the finances of their home? And they had jobs, part-time jobs, and they had those jobs because they were helping to add to, paying some of the finances of the home. And now they are probably not working. They've been, either furloughed or whatever it is that they're calling it. And so what do we say to those young people in terms of the stresses that might bring, not only to them, but their whole entire family regarding those finances?
That's a tough one because I know there's students who still are out there working or want to go to work. And for me, it's a hard thing when I don't want my kids to get sick. I don't want them to be exposed. And I understand that there's also financial reality for their family. That's a hard one, Gayl.
I'm sorry, I like to throw out the hard ones because it's the reality of a lot of our young people.
It is. It really is.
Especially young people who maybe their parents were immigrants or are immigrants, and they are able to work, and maybe their parents aren't able to work. And we have to think about those things too as well. And so the additional stresses that is even putting on the whole entire family. And yeah, I mean, I myself don't have the answer, so I'm just kind of throwing it out there in terms of what do we do with these young people who have to manage that, and also maybe having to manage maybe school. So maybe some of these young people who are not connecting with school is because they're so stressed about the financial realities that's happening within their households.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I agree, there are no answers. I mean, I don't think that's an easy answer, but I think maybe thinking in resources. And one of the things that, I try to do is to provide as many resources, whether it's giving information about housing and letting students know you can't be evicted or your house can't be foreclosed on right now. Also resources like finding things to meditate or just relax. So there are apps like Liberate meditation app, which is great. So maybe giving resources like that. We try to do a Wellness Wednesdays for our students. And so every Wednesday we send out a self-care tip. So they may, for some kids, it may be helpful. Some people is like, they just keep rolling. They don't know what to deal with that. But I think, we're just trying to do the best and try to give different access points for students and families.
Forgive me if I say anything wrong or disrespectful, but I see for like teenagers, for example, to go back with the finances and we're helping our families. As a teenager, like in the motions going through whether or not I'm going to be getting paid this summer or whether or not I'll be getting paid until the end of my youth program during the school year. I think the big question is, why is it such a problem for teenagers to be getting paid for doing nothing, but it's not for adults, if that makes sense? Like I know a lot of youth organizations are kind of like, well, we just don't have the money in the budget to be paying teenagers to sit at home and do nothing. But I feel like, isn't that with some adults, they're getting paid to sit at home and do the same amount of work that teenagers might be doing? So why do you think that there's like such a problem like between adults and teenagers?
That's real.
Ageism.
And any of you adults
It
want to
is
answer?
ageism.
Any of you adults want to answer that question?
Ignorance, I think, on the part of
Yeah.
adults. Seriously, I appreciate that's a piercing question and gets to really the heart of sort of how little we understand, how little we've learned to understand, you know, what's at the heart of the way communities function and self-nourish. Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure there are ways that teens can continue to be valuable or productive or helpful to organizations. Whether it's social media, you guys are social media experts, most of you anyway, and there are ways that you can kind of help continue to promote your organization. So I think organizations just need to be creative in thinking about that. But I think that's a great question, Naesoj, and I think it needs to be, you know, put out there even more, like, why not?
Counselor?
Yes.
Yes, that's right, Naesoj. You better own this space. Yeah, so you know that's a really good question, and Gayl, you know hold on one quick second. Yo, ¿se puede oír todo eso? I worked when I was in high school. I worked 3 jobs. I worked at McDonald's. I worked at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I sold shoes at Tommy Can Shoe Store. And I did that because I had to, right? I had to for the same reasons why Gayl pointed out. And it was a lot of financial stress at home. And I think what's happening here is that young people are feeling the financial impact. But I think that the news media and everything that you see just continues to add more to the doom and gloom of the reality. And I think that also impacts the way young people are reacting and feeling that sense of urgency. So I think that that's something else that I want to uplift is that it's not just about the I'm being distracted. Hold on. I'll come back.
All right. So I just want to, talk a little bit now about, I'm thinking about those seniors, right, in high school. And I would imagine they were looking forward to a number of things. Those who probably were thinking of going to their prom, those who were thinking about, the next steps in their lives and, the transition from, whether it might have been transition from high school to working, high school to, college, high school to a trade school, high school to maybe taking a few months off. Those young people I'm thinking about in terms of where they might be at this point in time, and what can we share with them, and how can we support them in helping them to transition into the next phase, especially with the fact that we are still in this phase of, shelter at home, shelter in place, and how do they, kind of prepare for next steps?
I think, there aren't any easy answers. There's some things that you just don't have answers to because a lot of the resolution lies in, it's not within your control. So, I'm sitting and I'm thinking about like, well, how do you help adolescents celebrate, even that, they're not able to go to a prom, or can you do those things at home? What can you do in the natural environment to help them transition into a less natural environment? I don't really know what that looks like, but it does start with having these conversations that we are now, because we weren't prepared for any of this. Who knew that this was going to happen? So like now we're thinking, we're planning, we're collaborating. We still don't have all the answers. So I think that's something worth thinking about.
And to add on to your point, Shara, is that let's get the students' voice in that. So
Yes,
it's their graduation, it's their prom, bringing their voice into what might work, what might be helpful for them.
Yes, because so often we tend to forget that they also have a voice too. And how do we include them in the conversations of what would be best for them? We are so used to saying, well, this is how you should do it, or this is what we want you to do, or this is how things should be done. How do we create a platform for them to be able to, and it may not even be one way, it could be a number of ways, and what fits for that group of student and what fits for this group of students. So we could have even different ways of helping them to celebrate, and not just one way for that to happen.
So I wanted, there's another question that came from Facebook. This one is specifically for Naesoj. It says, can you ask the young lady how important practicing self-care is and ways that youth can do it?
Me personally, I think self-care is very essential to the youth's mental health. Maybe I know relaxing or just working out for me has done a lot during this quarantine. Even learning something new for me, I'm into makeup, so even like perfecting my craft, that's what I've been trying to do. If you're into driving, maybe going out for a few hours like around your neighborhood, but also trying to stay safe, maybe practicing for a permit test or anything like that. Anything you're interested in. I think keeping busy with stuff you're interested in during this time is very good, because we usually wouldn't have the time to do this stuff.
Excellent.
Great. There was another question that was asked in terms of what about children who are in, or even young people who are in abusive situations. So it could be emotionally abusive situation, physical abusive situation, sexually abusive situation. You know, what do we do about those young people? That was a question from Facebook. And how can they, so the addition to this is how can they deal with that without the fear of getting sick?
I'm not too much of an expert on this kind of stuff, and I actually don't really know how it would look to be helping these young people. But I think I go back to the point where it's just relating. So there may not be much that can be done now, but I think when we come out of quarantine, knowing, I think emphasize, I don't know the word, empathy, yes, empathy, having
Yes.
empathy for those young people that we know had a very hard time during quarantine. And I just think not trying to put them back into how things were, but smoothly transitioning them is the best thing that we can do for them after quarantine, since there's not much that can be done now.
Yeah, and I would add to that. Thank you, Naesoj. Just maybe Julia, add in some crisis numbers on your Facebook page will be helpful. So there's a National Domestic Violence Hotline. There are hotlines for LGBTQ youth, the Trevor Project. So giving people access to some of those hotlines may be helpful, that they can reach out. They can call. A lot of them now text. So if you're worried about having to talk, you can just text those numbers. So I'm happy to share those with you as well.
Yeah. You know, and speaking of LGBTQ youth, just kind of want to raise up there are a lot of young people right now who are in homes where they're not being able to be fully expressed.
Yeah.
And so just curious in terms of anything that parents can do differently, right? Anything that young people can do to help them cope in this space, and would be great if we can hear some tips around that. And the whole idea of abuse, I think emotional, mental, physical, and financial abuse all exist, and sometimes that abuse is even our parents are the ones who are being abusive. And so kids don't feel safe in certain homes. And so just wondering what perspective and insight you can give to that, and some words of encouragement or some guidance to some of our young people right now who are in homes where they don't feel loved.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. And I know that there are students right now who are in those homes where they may not be out, or they may be out, but just worry about their physical and emotional safety. I always say, for if you're not out yet, like I always tell kids, like there's no hurry, and like you don't need to like make a decision that's going to put yourself in an unsafe situation. So if you're not open with your family, there's no need to necessarily do it right now where you don't have access to supports. I think for students who have shared but also are aware that their families are not really accepting of their identity, excuse me, I think for parents, again, I come from a culture, it's very homophobic. And I know that those attitudes exist. And the hope is for kids is to, do what they need to protect themselves in this moment. I think for families, I think allowing your kids to be who they are, or just, call like truce. We're not going to discuss these topics right now because they're just too fiery for everyone. So I think there are different approaches. But I think, for the kids, many of them know what they need to do to stay safe. And again, having access to resources outside the home, whether it's through text that they can access when they are feeling really discouraged, it can be helpful.
And I just want to add, if you are an adult who knows that this is a particular young people that you have been supporting, check in on them. Check in with them to make sure that they're still feeling a sense of safety. And even if it means if you have a car and you drive by the home and just have them wave out the window, if you can do that, just to say that I'm still here for you. I can't come close, but I just want you to know that if you look out your window, you'll see me, and just wave. And, so how can we be creative in this moment as adults to help support our young people who may need us because they might be in environments where we as adults might know beforehand, before we went into quarantine, that they weren't feeling safe enough within their environments. So what is our responsibility to stay connected to those young people too as well? I think that's so important.
I want to touch on what you said, Dr. Gayl, about young people needing adults. I think that's very important. And I also want to say, for me personally, having a lot of friends a part of the LGBTQ community, and even having parents a part of the LGBTQ plus community, I think there's a big difference between accept and respect. And I think a lot of adults see us and they're like, oh, you want me to accept this lifestyle and I just can't. But sometimes it's not about accepting, it's about respecting. You don't have to accept the way I am, but as long as you can respect the way I am and respect the way I want to live, then I think the communication would be much better between parents and their children that identify as LGBTQ plus.
Thank you for that.
I actually wanted.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I wanted to add to that, Gayl. I was thinking pretty much what you had shared. DV's on the rise. Emotional, physical, sexual abuse is on the rise. People have a different way of responding to stressors. And while it's great to have resources and telephone numbers, and that's wonderful, but sometimes it calls for immediate intervention. And so what does that look like? So Gayl, I agree with having a check-in plan. Just, wave your hand if you're okay, but what if you're not? And those are the things that I kind of struggle with. It's what would be an immediate response. Did you say to somebody, in spite of, this awful virus, you can still go out your house and go to the police? I don't know what that looks like, but if it came down to that, and I was in that position, it's exactly what I would do. I also maybe encouraging youth and parents or caregivers to create some sort of a social support group, whether you do it by Zoom or something like that, because it gives us a sense of accountability to one another.
I agree with that, and it reminds me of the issue we were talking about before this, the kind of strange balance or tension around screen time. Even though there are absolutely going to be downsides to our young adults spending more time online, there are solid resources as well for young adults. Bagley.org is still, doing that organization is still doing its best to support LGBTQ plus youth in the Boston area, and even for parents who are trying to find ways, like Naesoj says, to learn respect. pflag.org is another really good organization.
I just was wondering, did we ask the question that Jasmine Rodriguez had about what about students dealing with the abuse at home? How can they deal with that while being in quarantine? And if they can't leave their house because of getting sick, and their fear of getting sick?
Yes, I think we did ask that question in regards to the abuse and how do we help them to sort of navigate that particular situation. I want to switch over a little bit to, again, it's still about young people and young people who may have been having, thoughts of suicide, and how do we, again, what supports might we, I know there's the suicide hotline out there, but so many young people may not feel like comfortable enough sort of dialing those numbers, or when you're in that state of, there's nothing else I can do or should do. What how do we help our young people begin to sort of sift through those thoughts, those feelings about feeling so stressed that they feel like there's no way out, right? So how can we help them in terms of seeing that there is a way out? So what might be your tips, strategies to help young people be able to manage those feelings and those thoughts, and at the same time practice self-care?
Right. So I was going to say that I think one of the things is helping them to establish some sort of a coping skills. We didn't talk very much about coping skills, and also there's a spiritual component to this as well.
Mm.
So getting them involved in that, well, what is it that you want or can do for yourself, and how can we help you? So this is going to be the time for conversation, for families coming together, for planning together, because it's not just, like we said, it's not one person, it's not just an adolescent, but it's also just a family unit. But I think coping skills is very, very important, as well as a spiritual component.
We have a question from Liz Coley, and they said, so should safety planning as a worst case scenario still be advocated? And what kind of safety planning should they have?
That's an excellent question in regards to that. And so just shifting back a little bit to, if that particular young person have a supportive adult outside of their home structure that they feel that they can connect with, I would encourage you to connect with that support system outside of your household that you don't feel that you have. And again, I don't want to burden another young person, but sometimes reaching out to another friend who might have an adult supportive connection that they can connect you to as well. We're in a situation where it's hard for young people to figure out how to navigate. They may not have already trusted certain adults, and what adults do I need to trust? So within the context of a safety plan, I would say, reach out to any adult that you feel a sense of that you have a sense of connection with, and let them know how you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you need in that moment. If it means reaching out to a friend that you trust who can reach out to another adult who can support you in that process. I don't know if any of the other panelists have any other thoughts or ideas in ways in which our young people can do some safety planning.
I would just emphasize again this notion that there might be something wrong about bringing up the worst case scenario, that I might either hurt someone's feelings or scare someone by bringing that up. And I really would want to emphasize how important it is to stretch oneself. And yes, talk about that worst case scenario. That's a healthy thing to do. So I think it's an excellent question.
So
Yeah, and I think, yeah, go ahead. I was just going to add on to what Jim was saying, is that, yeah, when we plan for the worst, then we know how to respond. We're just not, because when you're in that situation, then there's a response, there's a plan you've already made, and you know what to do, rather than being caught off guard and feeling really stressed out by the situation, and then needing to figure out how to respond in that situation. So I agree. again, find, trusted adults. Sometimes there are peers who are also very helpful. Look at Naesoj, for example, right? Who are students who are also have access to resources. And I would emphasize if there's organizations that you've worked with before, and I do feel like it is helpful. I know when mentioned Boston Glass for LGBTQ youth, they also do a really great programming for youth, and they have a lot of virtual resources as well, virtual support groups. So there are resources out there, and I think it's on us to help make sure that you have access to those resources.
Okay, great. Naesoj, there's some other questions that you want to?
Yeah, we actually have a couple of things coming at us. So Christian White said something about the resources, and he said, I'm not so sure it's a lack of resources versus trying to get the youth to engage in them. And then he also asks, should teachers play a role in creating safety plans, seeing that parents are taking on some of the teachers' roles?
I guess one of those questions would be too, in terms of how do we support the parents who are taking on the teacher's role if they're able to do that. But I think it's a great question in terms of, whose responsibility, I guess he's sort of asking it is to assist or to help with that safety planning.
Yeah, I think if teachers feel like they have I'm always mindful that I never want my teachers to practice outside of their expertise or competence. So I wouldn't want them to do a suicide plan with a student because it's not part of their education. So I would say stay within your practice. If you know the student was experiencing some suicide thoughts or self-harm thoughts, then connecting with your counselor at school and maybe being the bridge between that student and the counselor. I think general safety planning is like in terms of, do you know where to go if you need help, or do you have numbers to call if you need support? I think teachers, advisors, adults in schools, definitely that's helpful. And I think, again, sometimes it's hard for parents, one, if they don't know or they don't have that close relationship with their children, then it can be hard to step in on a role and do safety planning when the child may not trust you.
Yes, Julia.
Y'all gonna be like, I thought she was just gonna come in and listen. She's like all part of the panel. You guys better put me on Facebook. That's how I'll participate moving forward. But I am curious, I want to go back to the suicide conversation, and so I'll just basically say that there's also a lot of stigma that is associated with that. And so I know being an immigrant this country, there's also some fear around disclosing any type of suicidal thoughts because you think that you might lose your immigration status, or your families think you might because whatever the case is. And so I'm an open book, right? It's a blessing and a curse at the same time. But I'll tell you this is that 4 or 5 years ago, I participated in a conversation around trauma in the village that it was hosted by Kozbach in New York. And Gayl, you were there. And I was, I was in my 40s by the time that I realized that, when I was a kid, I attempted to commit suicide when I was younger. And my mom was so afraid of what could happen that she didn't even take me to the hospital. What she did was she made me drink oil and milk so that I can, vomit. And I grew up believing that my mom did not love me because she didn't even care to take me to the hospital. And I later realized that she was so afraid to take me to the hospital for those reasons, right? For the immigration situation. But more importantly, she said that if anyone knew that I tried to commit suicide, that I would never get a job in America and that they would never give me a job. So I believe that too, and she believed it. And so I'm sharing this not to get too personal about my own journey, but I think it's really important for us to recognize how parents oftentimes carry our own trauma and we pass it on to our kids and our own beliefs about mental wellness. And because we think we're protecting our kids, but in reality, what we're doing is not creating a safe space for them to be fully expressed, right? And so I know that when it comes to suicide, it's one of those, uncomfortable topics, but I know there are a lot of kids right now, and then we know this, and I've read articles that Black and brown children, we've seen a spike of kids who are suicidal, and some who have been unfortunately successful at it. And now more so than ever, if people are in isolation and you can't read those signs, and sometimes kids log into their classroom, but they're not connected. So you really can't see what is happening with that child. And so I'm just wondering that's a lot to unpack, but I'm just really curious about how this lands and what can we do, and those people who are listening to this conversation, what can we do?
I just want to thank you, Julia. I want to touch on something you said about Black and brown children. I think as a community, we need to come together and get rid of like the idea that Black and brown children are depressed or don't have suicidal thoughts, because I think a big thing is Black and brown children and their families feel as though their parents don't care. And a lot of stuff, I'm not even gonna lie, a lot of stuff I heard growing up is, oh, that's for white kids, like you don't need therapy, that's for white kids. And I think that's very toxic and damaging to Black and brown children who feel like they're depressed as well, but feel like they don't have anywhere to go because their parents don't believe don't believe that they have actual problems.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll jump in. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. Thank you, Julia, for sharing your story. And I just know sharing your story probably touched somebody right now. So one of the things I do want to put a plug for, I'm working with Samaritans, Inc., my church, Myrtle Baptist Church, and my organization, Naesoj. We actually have a suicide prevention training on May 2nd at 10 a.m. It's at www.naesoj.com events. You can register, it's free, and it's a virtual event. And the goal is really to increase our knowledge about the signs and the risk factors of suicide, and also talk about what we can do, how we can support someone if they shared something with us, how we can be listeners and caregivers in that space. So I just want to make a plug for that. And I think we all need to make sure we're educated about what that looks like. And I thank you, Naesoj, also for, I know I talk to many students, and part of my role, I hear students, I work with families who for the first time are hearing that their child has a significant depression issue or have made a suicide attempt. And so it can be very hard, because for many parents, it then feels like some failure as a parent, right? I did something wrong, I'm a bad parent. And something that blocks them from seeing what their child needs in that moment. So I am often at the front lines of helping families navigate these very tricky situations with children when they're having these acute mental health crises. I think, like Naesoj is saying, and Julia, from your story, is, really just to listen and honor people's stories, and not to minimize or tell kids this, you don't feel that way, or, that's for somebody else if they're telling you. So to kind of suspend that judgment and really kind of listen and hear. And I always try to talk to parents about, well, what do you notice? I try to, and for many times, most of them, they have noticed some change in their children, but I think it's just not knowing what to do or how to intervene can make it really hard for them.
Yeah, and families and parents feeling very helpless. So just adding to that, not knowing what to do.
It's scary to hear your child tell you they want to die or kill themselves.
Right. I remember a friend of mine who had, was concerned about, his child, and was saying, the child is not going to school. Brilliant young person, not going to school there. So I said to him, I'm wondering if maybe your child might be depressed. And he said, what? Depressed? What does he have to be depressed about? I gave him food, I gave him shelter, he's got this, he's got that. And then, again, and this person was from the island, so that adds another additional cultural belief or value or stigma that's added to not only mental health, but anything that is foreign to them. And his response was, I should be depressed. I grew up in a family where I had to, cook and clean and work, and I had to walk barefoot to get to school, and then so I should be depressed. So he has nothing to be depressed about, and just educating that parent around. Even though the child may have all these things, there might be some other things in terms of the child not feeling a sense of worth, a child not feeling a sense of, are they enough? Feeling some sense of guilt and shame around, things that they might believe about themselves. And I think after that conversation with the parent, he was able to say, you know what, makes sense, right? But it's so often because parents don't know what to do, how to handle it for themselves. So then therefore it's hard to believe that my child is experiencing these kinds of feelings. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Dr. Gayl. I also want to say, it's about parents listening as well, because I know one of my mom's friends a little while ago said, I'm not going to listen to a 26-year-old guidance counselor that's never even raised a child before. And I think that's the biggest way parents can go wrong, because while you may think you know your child, you're not an expert. And not saying this person's an expert, but they went to school for this, they've learned about it, they may know how to connect more to your child than you do. So I think another big thing is just parents listening to their child and listening to the people who are listening to their children, because that's the biggest way to reach out to them at this point.
And I think too, what I really try to do when I'm talking with parents is I do see them as experts, and I don't act as though I know more than them. I kind of really try to diffuse that power, because I want to engage with them and collaborate. We want to be partners working together. If I come to a parent telling you need to do this, you need to do this, they're going to tune me out, regardless of how old I am or how long I've been in this field. And so if we can see our families as partners and collaborators and not just telling them what they need to do, I think they're more likely to engage. And one of the things I want to add to back is we also want to be mindful of language, and some of our language sometimes stigmatizes people who have suicidal thoughts. So I know there's been a real shift in our language and not saying commit suicide, but die by suicide, because it just stigmatizes the act. It's not a crime, right? So commit suicide, conveys that it's a crime or there's something wrong. And so we talk about die by suicide or have thoughts of death or dying.
Thank you. I love these things. You get to learn new things, and no, that's great.
So I see there's another question from Christian. Can we revisit what the young lady just said about the stigma involving race as it relates to, the Black and Brown communities, and ways we can destigmatize it in our Black and Brown communities?
Which young lady? We're all young ladies here. Sorry, Jim, sorry.
Well, all the young ladies who spoke. Yeah. So what do we do about the destigmatization of again, mental health?
I think I'll jump in, because that's the mission of my organization, Psych. Our goal is really to change the cultural narratives around mental health and emotional wellness. My goal is I've created an online directory, and my goal is to just get as many therapists out there so we can see that therapists come in many shapes, sizes, cultures, cultural backgrounds, languages, countries of origins. That's our goal, to really kind of push that. And also doing work around educating. So a big piece is about going into the communities and educating our communities about mental health, emotional. You kind of use emotional wellness as my way in, and then I sneak in mental health. Yeah. But really kind of breaking it down. What does it look like? So not doing what the DSM might tell us what these disorders look like, but really breaking it down into what might it look like in my day-to-day life. I can't get up and go to work, or I don't have motivation, or Sunday night I dread going to work. How do we make it in language that people can relate to? I think that is one that, around education is a big piece, and making it culturally responsive, making it make sense from a cultural perspective.
And I'm glad you said that about language. And sometimes what I say is brain health. And I remind people, isn't your brain a part of your whole body too as well? So it's just as important to make sure your brain is healthy as the rest of your body is also healthy too as well. So language is so important when we are talking about quote unquote the mental health, and what are some ways in which within our Black and Brown communities we can shift that language so that people feel a sense of connection to, yes, this makes sense for us. So we have about 5 minutes, and I just want to so this is one I like to end on sort of positive notes, so to speak. And so my question is, as we think about youth as a collective, what is important for them to know about believing in themselves, or to recognize their true source of power or self-worth? What are your thoughts? What do you want to leave with them with that? What's important for them to know? Sorry again.
No, I know. It's so like we have 5 minutes only for that.
Well, we can probably keep going if people are still here, but let's start.
I'll start with the Maya Angelou quote.
Okay.
In struggle lies joy, right? And so this is a really tough time, but find the moments of laughter and humor in this. I think as people of color, humor is something that we use to survive and cope with, and just to manage difficult situations. So don't forget your humor. Tap into hobbies and new ways of tapping into your hobbies. And I would just lift up Naesoj and like find your voice, and find people like with that your voice, and kind of bring those voices together to amplify things that you need.
Okay, great.
And I would also say the same, absolutely. And use your resources, your support. I think that people need to hear, you can do this. You can do this. Make sure that you do use your supports, and don't forget about the things that make you happy. You don't have to put those things to the side, but you can do it. It can be done.
Okay. All right.
Absolutely. You have faith in yourself. Those things that bring you joy, try not to let somebody else, put you down for whatever those things are. Keep going, keep exploring. Yeah, the power really is with you.
And for me, I'd like to say that young people have the ideas and the creativity and the energy to shape a better world. And we need you.
Absolutely. Yes. Naesoj, any parting words for your peers?
I think I would just say, definitely, I've been going by the motto, manifest the life you want. So whenever you hear, what if it doesn't happen? What if you can't do it? Don't think what if, just talk about the life you want, breathe the life you want, work towards the life you want, and that'll be the life you get.
I quote you on that one. I love that.
Yeah.
You can place it on your website and put her name under it.
I will.
Yes,
Trust me.
yes. And I'd just like to say that it's important that you remember who you are, and you have the internal wisdom and the internal power to extend that onto not only your peers, to also the adults who are in this world, because we don't know it all, and we need your voice. We still need you. And how can we rescue one another? Even within our relationships with one another, we can still find healing and a better path forward. And we need you in order to make that better path forward. So I just want to leave that. And I'm going to leave the last words to Councillor Mejia to end us off this evening.
Yes, Counselor.
So first of all, just thank you again for such a rich and keeping it real conversation. I think that this is exactly what literally the doctor ordered. This mental wellness is really important, especially not just during COVID, but just in general in our community. So grateful for that. And I know this is being recorded and it's live, but I think that there is something very beautiful about being vulnerable and about being honest. And I think you guys created a space for me to be able to do both here and here. And the thing that I would leave for young people is that, I'm still standing, right? And so we all have a purpose in life, and when we are living our purpose, there's nothing we can do. So just keep on plugging away. I know sometimes it might be difficult, but we all got you.
Yes.
Amen.
And thank you all again for being part of this forum, and especially to our young person like myself and Naesoj for being in the space. So we appreciate you. And again, thank you for being a part of this first panel for our young people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayl.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you, Naesoj. Bye, Dr. Jackman. Thank
Bye.
you.
Good to see you.